Hi, and welcome back to Focal Point AFR Talk. Brian Fisher is my name, your congenial, convivial, and amiable host. I want you to know I got a text from my wife during the last break telling me to just kind of calm down, settle down a little bit. Apparently, I wasn't paying attention because she walked into the studio and gave me the look just 2 minutes ago. My guest, Bill Federer, saw that. So I am now Mr. Rogers for this entire segment. I'm calm, cool, and collected. And honored to welcome once again to our Focal Point studio a frequent guest here on Focal Point, author and historian Bill Federer. Bill, welcome back.
Brian, great to be with you.
Now, a couple of things I want to talk about with you, Bill. I want to get into your new book. It's called Miracles in American History, particularly appropriate in light of what went on at the Democratic National Convention, where they kicked God completely out of their platform and then clumsily kind of reinserted him. But one of the issues that I wanted to chat with you about just for a moment is this whole issue of voter fraud. I've got a story in front of me. 3 Arkansas Democrats and a police officer pleaded guilty to absentee voter fraud yesterday. This is right at the same time Democrats are out saying, no, we don't need any kind of voter ID laws. You got to show 3 forms of photo ID just to get near the Democratic National Convention. Here's a Democrat being convicted of voter fraud using absentee ballots. So it sounds like it's a problem, and your observations about
it. I ran for Congress 3 times. We had such blatant voter fraud. They lost boxes of ballots. They left my name off the ballot in 5 wards in the city. I mean, and so they've been perfecting it. And so Eric Holder is helping to strike down every state law that says you have to show an ID to vote. I mean, people can't buy cigarettes and booze without showing a photo ID, yet they're going to vote for the leader of the free world. And so they're anticipating a lot of voter fraud. The second thing is the October surprise. Now, this is a dirty campaign strategy. You can go to Google, you look it up, October surprise, and it's a crisis you saved for the last week, an attack that the other side does not have time to respond, get mailers out, buy airtime and so forth. Even back in Jimmy Carter's time, the October surprise. But there was a classic one about 10 years ago. They knew about it for a year, that the head of the National Evangelical Association, Ted Haggart, was having homosexual liaisons. They saved it to the last week before the election, and when it came out, especially because he was championing some marriage amendments, this dominated the news cycle, and the conservatives stayed home. Democrats won Congress. They voted Nancy Pelosi in as the speaker. And so it was a classic example of October surprise. And there is evidence that the subprime mortgage crisis was one of these. A friend of mine, Kevin Freeman, wrote a book about how there was manipulation of the stock market and these different options and so forth. And when McCain chose Sarah Palin, enthusiasm was through the roof in the Republican Party. But when the subprime mortgage crisis happened, McCain did what? He called off his campaign, went back and voted for it, never regained the momentum. That could fall into the category of an October surprise. But I've been asking people, I've been doing this for the last year, what they think the October surprise is going to be. I've been in Washington, D.C. many times, and they think anything from class warfare, wanting to have violence break out, maybe with an Occupy Wall Street group, and then some other interesting stories. One is to intentionally put Israel into a position where war breaks out with Iran. And then because of this crisis, the president can say it's an emergency and take control of the radio, TV, and internet, and then make himself the FDR, I'm the savior president, and start usurping all kinds of power. The days click by, election's over, he's back in. Another one is interesting, and that was out of a news service in Canada, as actually some plot on his life that was planned and that could be blamed on these right-wing Tea Party hateful people. And believe it or not, that's a strategy that Stalin used. 1935, Stalin had a Tea Party movement that was starting in the Soviet Union, and he didn't like this. It was anti-Stalinists. And yet Stalin had a supporter that was gaining a little too much attention. His name was Sergei Kirov. And Sergei Kirov loved Stalin, was giving these speeches that he was the liberator of the workers of the world. And so Stalin had a plan. It was to assassinate Sergei Kirov and blame it on the anti-Stalinists. And he used that as an excuse to kill millions of these people. And so this is a strategy. And I think, well, would this happen? I don't know if you can vote to kill innocent babies. What can't you justify? But these are things that fall into the October surprise category.
And it is interesting, you look at what the Department of Homeland Security has done when they talk about terrorism. I mean, they've gone out of their way to class pro-lifers as terrorists, returning veterans as terrorists, conservative Christians as terrorists. I mean, the real issue with terrorism is with those that are motivated by Islamic convictions. But I mean, that's kind of creating a template that they could use to pull that off. Now, Bill, in the time we've got left, I want to talk about your new book, Miracles in American History, and particularly the context. Is yesterday we saw the Democrats, they had removed God from the party platform, completely out of, for the first time in history of the Democratic Party platform, no mention of God whatsoever. Then they got in big trouble for that, hastily scrambled around, violated their own procedural rules to get him back in there. But they're making a deliberate attempt, or did, not even to acknowledge the existence of God in American life or history. But what your research is finding is God has been very present in our history.
Well, yeah. I mean, even recently it was Democrat President Harry S. Truman that instituted the annual National Day of Prayer. Interestingly enough, it was Harry S. Truman, a Democrat, that pushed through recognizing Israel. Right? Truman pushed through the United Nations. One of the very first things the United Nations did was to recognize Israel. So we see a backtracking on that. FDR, a Democrat, during World War II, he passed out Gideon's New Testaments and Book of Psalms. Now, in this book, it's called Miracles in American History. I have compiled, my wife had the idea for it, and I put together the research and stories. I sent out a daily email called the American Minute. AmericanMinute.com is my website. And so these are like 32 of those stories sort of expanded of crises. So there's the Battle of Midway. The Japanese have 4 carriers. They're dominating the Pacific. We have days of prayer being called, and our guys take off. One group comes in low, and the Japanese wipe them out. And they thought that was the only attack, so they're back on deck refueling. Meanwhile, we have some of our dive bombers that are late, and they are up at high altitude, and through the clouds they spot the Japanese carriers, and all the planes are either down or they've taken off to attack the Americans. And these guys dive bomb. In 15 minutes, they sink 3 Japanese carriers, and then shortly after a 4th, the Japanese are now switched from the offensive to the defensive. The whole tide turns in the course of the war. That's the Battle of Midway.
One I want you to talk about, Bill, that I think you sent out in an American Minute not long ago, was George Washington's evacuation of our troops during the conflict with Britain from Brooklyn Heights. Can you talk to us about that? That was a true miracle.
The largest invasion force ever assembled in world history up to this point. The British had packed the harbor in New York. Over 400 ships. It looked like a forest of trees because of the masts, right? And Washington had all of his defenses facing the water. And a traitor, a loyalist, led the British, 10,000 of them, through Jamaica Pass. And the next morning, they attacked Washington from behind. And if it wasn't for the Maryland regiment, they would have been all wiped out. But these young Maryland guys charged 6 times. They all got killed. But this allows the Americans to sort of regroup. And it's a fiasco all day long. And the night sets. And Washington is now pinned up against the water. The next day, the war's over. I mean, this is the entire American army.
And this is the entire history of America is at stake here. There's if something doesn't happen here, there's no America.
And so Washington ferries his troops all night long across the East River to Manhattan Island. These are 8,000 troops. And the sun begins to come up the next day. He's got half his troops strung out on the water. Half his troops are trying to, leave. And then a fog settles. And this is what his chief of intelligence, Benjamin Talmadge, wrote. As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety. And when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise off the river and seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. We tarried until the sun had risen, but the fog remained as dense as ever. Well, they evacuated, and Washington was on the last boat to leave. The fog lifts, the British charge up the hill. There's nobody there except a couple drunk guys that were raiding the storehouse. And that was the last chance the British had to capture the whole army at once. And anyway, the Americans were chased all the way through New York, New Jersey, and then they crossed into Pennsylvania. 6 months' time, Washington's troops go from 20,000 down to 2,000. And these they give the "Give me liberty, give me death" speeches, and they all leave Philadelphia, and they send Washington a note saying, "Until further notice, you're in charge of America." And so Washington, on Christmas Day evening of 1776, he leads these ragtag guys across the ice-filled Delaware River. They attack at Trenton. They catch the German Hessian troops. These were these were hired murderers. These guys were the fiercest troops in Europe. And Washington is able to capture 1,000 of them. And this is the first real victory of the war and begins to turn the tide, the Battle of Trenton. And so Washington said the hand of Providence has been so conspicuous in the course of the war that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith. But he says, it'll be time enough for me to turn preacher when my present appointment ceases. So when I'm done being general, I can be a preacher. They had a day of fasting and prayer every year during the Revolutionary War. Fasting and prayer. John Adams writes, millions will be upon their knees imploring the Almighty to intervene on our behalf. Another interesting one was enemies foreign and domestic. There was a hero of the Battle of Saratoga named Benedict Arnold. He was real popular, but he was married to a young wife who was a loyalist. And so she felt like the Americans did not appreciate her husband. And so she gets a British spy named John Andre to meet with her husband, Benedict Arnold, who is now the commander of West Point. Now, those of you that aren't familiar with geography, the Hudson River goes north and south, splitting New York in half, and West Point is right at the mouth of it. So if you control West Point, you control the Hudson, but if you split New York, you got New England on one side and then the middle southern colonies on the other side, so you basically split America in half. And so Benedict Arnold, for the equivalent of $1 million today, decided to betray West Point to the British. And Washington was supposed to visit that very day. Well, John Andre meets with Benedict Arnold, and he leaves dressed as a civilian. The Americans, sentries, catch him. They search him, and they find a map of West Point folded up in the heel of his boot. They march him back into Benedict Arnold's office, and they say, this guy was about to betray your fort. And Benedict Arnold says, wait right here. He leaves on a ship called the Vulture, right? And we hang the John Andre, the spy. But if he had not been caught, not only would West Point have been taken, but George Washington would have been captured. The war would have been over.
Our guest has been Bill Federer. I want to recommend everything Bill Federer does. Go to AmericanMinute.com and sign up for that daily update. Get his new book, Miracles in American History. Great book. Thank you, Bill, for taking time to be with us, and God bless you, my friend.
Hey, we need to pray for a miracle today. And,
absolutely.
God bless.
Amen. Thank you. Back in 2. Stay with us.
If we